It's a long passage, and it breaks up things a little bit, and they read it far better than I could, so thank you very much indeed. You ever come to a passage and think, well, maybe have we bitten off a little bit more than we can chew? And it's a long and complex passage, speaking of the glory and the majesty of God. What a vision Ezekiel gets. We've already been singing, well, open the eyes of my heart to see you high and lifted up, standing in the light of your glory. Just imagine. What would it be like to actually see God? What is he like? How do I get to know God? And how can I believe in something or someone that I can't see or touch or hear? And perhaps most importantly, how would my life be changed if I had an encounter with God this week? Let's have a brief look at this passage here. I will just open up things very briefly at the end to a few times of questions and discussion, if anyone would like to. And if I can't answer a question, I'll call on the assembled wisdom in the room here. Provided it's brief. Poor old Julie's doing Sunday school upstairs, and I can stretch out a little bit later. But I don't know how we get on with the book of Ezekiel. It's an obscure book to many of us. There are some passages that maybe we know quite well. There's Ezekiel 37, for example, that talks about the vision of the valley of the dry bones. Maybe you've heard preaching from chapter 47 of this river that's full of fish coming out of the city. But perhaps for the rest of the book, most of us would maybe struggle to explain what the overall purpose of the book is and how it all hangs together. Well, who is Ezekiel? Now this is one for the very old people in the room. Who's this band? If you're Boney M, yes, yeah. If you're around in the 70s and 80s, these guys were huge. They had a massive following all over the world, in India, Russia, you name it. They were huge, and they had massive hits. And one of their big hits was, of course, by the rivers of Babylon, where we sat down, and there we wept when we remembered Zion. And those are words that are directly lifted from Psalm 137. So it's a tenuous connection, but this is where Ezekiel is. Ezekiel it starts off by saying it's in the 30th year, so that's probably his 30th year. Maybe it's his 30th birthday. And he's gone down with his friends to the canal, or to the river Kebar, which is in the land of Babylon. They're by the rivers of Babylon. And this is now in modern day Iraq. It's the big city. Jews from Judea and Jerusalem were taken by the Babylonians, and they were settled not in Babylon itself, but in an area that's now close to the modern day city of Nippur in Iraq. So they're about 900 miles away from Jerusalem in exile. As the crow flies, it's a shorter distance, but to travel that way by foot, you go follow the major rivers. So it's a distance of about 900 miles from their homeland. And we don't know that much about Ezekiel. We're told that he's a priest. We're told his father's name. We're told later on that he's a married man, but his wife dies in later chapters. He's struck dumb by God. And in fact, he doesn't regain his speech again until chapter 33. So in fact, much of the message to the exiles is either written down or is acted out, and is acted out in quite dramatic ways. It's almost like a play, or watching an actor speaking. And it's a long book. It's full of long and dramatic visions, such as the one we've read. It's warnings to other nations. It's warnings to God's people. And it contains prophecies of some events that have already been fulfilled, and other events that have still to happen. And maybe a useful way to break down the whole book of Ezekiel would be to look at these visions of God, because actually the vision that we've looked at in chapter 1 occurs again. It's a recurring vision. We see the same vision of God in chapter 10, and that's a section where actually Ezekiel is taken not to where he is in Babylonia, but he's brought to Jerusalem, and he sees God's glory leaving the temple. He sees the same picture of these living creatures, the wheels within wheels, and the likeness of a human figure, the expanse. And we see also the same vision that he refers to, that he says that this was the same vision that I saw by the same living creatures that I saw by the river Kamar. We see that again in chapter 43. So chapter 1, chapter 10, and chapter 43, the same vision of God. And if we were to briefly look at some of the content of what we've read in these verses, by the different readers here today, well, it's a bizarre and terrifying vision, isn't it? And it's a difficult one to do. And unfortunately, some people have slightly lost the run of themselves and can end up missing the point. If we were to break down these different sections, well, the first 3 verses that Lucia read, well, they kind of what we've talked about. They set the scene where Ezekiel is and where he sees this vision. The next section that Brian read for us, well, concerns these living creatures, or what's sometimes referred to as the cherubim. Now, I'm no artist, but this is a famous painting by the artist Raphael that was done in the 1500s. And I'm not quite sure that he was reading the same thing that we were reading, because these are the cherubim are there somewhere. When we think of cherubim, we think of Christmas, these kind of rather fat little babies with wings. And the cherubim that Brian read out to us, well, they're quite different, aren't they? They're rather terrifying figures. They're sort of large, they're covered in flame and fires, they've got 4 different faces, they've got 4 wings. They must have been quite astonishing to look at. There's also the, we still use this phrase, don't we, about wheels within wheels, that Paul talked about, or read in the next section from verse 16 to 21. I don't know what comes to your head. I find it actually, you could maybe try and do this. Go on YouTube and look at some of the sermons, and you can find all this AI-generated video about what Ezekiel might have seen, and an artist's impressions of the cherubim and the wheels within wheels. And one of the things I realized was that I actually sort of think in 2D, because when I thought of wheels within wheels, I thought of kind of one wheel inside another wheel, a bit like a caster or a hubcap on a car tire. But actually, why was a wheel within a wheel not at 90 degrees, like a gyroscope? So one wheel going in one direction and another wheel in the middle. So wheels within wheels, and these 4 living creatures. And I mean, what can we see from these? Well, there's the Bible. Sometimes there's quite in a lot of these visions we see 4 things. We see 4 living creatures in Revelation. In Zechariah we see about the 4 horses and the 4 chariots. There's we all know about in Revelation the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. There's the 4 winds. There's the 4 directions. There's the 4 corners of the earth that we still talk about. Funny phrase, isn't it? Because the earth's not flat. It's not square, but we still talk about the 4 corners of the earth. And I think that what Ezekiel is seeing here, well, it emphasizes to us that God is everywhere. He is omnipresent. He's from all 4 directions of the world. But one of the things that we're to realize here is that these are created things. These are not gods in themselves. They're not independent. They are not the main purpose of God's, of the vision that Ezekiel gets. Actually, the main thing, and the book ends in chapter 1, or verse 1 and verse 28, where Ezekiel twice says, I saw a vision of God, of Jehovah. And the cherubim, these terrifying creatures with their 4 heads and these wheels within wheels that move around, they're simply just the details. They're almost like the bits on a chessboard. They're not the main thing. The main vision that Ezekiel gets and that he wants to convey is of the God himself, who is above the expanse. These wheels within wheels, well, we read in Paul's section there, their rims are covered in eyes. God can see everywhere and can see everything. And they're not just all flying around at random, but the wheels are connected to the cherubim or to the living creatures. And they're all there to support the expanse. And actually, the whole vision that Ezekiel gets is almost like a vehicle, the chariot of God. God is on this vision that he gets of the likeness of the appearance of God. It's on the expanse which is supported by these 4 living creatures and the wheels. The wheels are connected to the living creatures. They're not just zooming around doing their own thing. And this is a moving vision. Again, this has led to some slightly odd speculation. So some people have even speculated that Ezekiel is seeing a UFO or UFOs. And there was a popular book that was written in the 1970s by a Swiss author called Erich von Daniken. It was called The Chariots of the Gods. And he looked at all these things like the statues on Easter Island and the straight lines that you can see in a place called the Nazca lines in Peru. And he said, well, these are all evidence that ancient civilizations came about by visitations from extraterrestrial beings arriving in their flying saucers. And supporting evidence, he said, well, when Ezekiel gets this vision, he's seeing flying saucers. Now, this is all a little bit far-fetched, and I think this is speculation at the very best. You can read through his arguments if you like, but this is basically a lot of nice theories that have no evidence to tie them together. So I do not think that Ezekiel is seeing UFOs. And this is what I said, that when people read this vision, they get maybe running down a sort of a little bit lost in the details. And this is not what Ezekiel is trying to convey. Ezekiel is trying to convey a vision of God. So what does, again back to Raphael's picture, what does God look like? Well, he gets part of it right, because actually Ezekiel's vision, he sees this expanse. It's an expanse like ice, like crystal, like a glacier, that's supported by the living creatures. There's a rainbow above it. There's clouds, there's smoke, there's fire. But Ezekiel, he sees a human figure. What does he say? He says, above, there's this great throne. It's made of sapphire, or some translations will say this old word of lapis lazuli, this wonderful, magnificent blue gem. That's the throne of God. And it's seated above the likeness of a throne was a likeness with a human appearance, like the appearance of fire, and upward from what had the appearance of his waist, I saw as it were gleaming metal, like the appearance of fire enclosed all around. And downward from what had the appearance of his waist, I saw as it were the appearance of fire, and there was brightness all around him. So a magnificent figure, burning, bright, and yet Ezekiel he doesn't get the full picture, does he? He doesn't see God in his full glory, but he gets the appearance of the likeness of God. And yet, God is not just a shadow. He's not like, remember in the Lord of the Rings where Sauron is represented as this fiery eye, and Ezekiel does not see this when he sees God. He sees a human-like figure. And that shouldn't surprise us, because as humans, we're made in the likeness of, or the image of God. It's not that God resembles us, but that actually we resemble him in some of his characteristics. Maybe we get used to this idea, we're told that, well, God is spirit. But actually, God is real. He can be seen. And I don't think it's stretching things too far when we read in the Bible, when it says about God's arm, God's ear. These aren't just symbolic terms, but God is recognizable. He has a figure. He is solid. And if we were to move on from, well, what do we learn from this, from these verses that we've read? What do we learn of this vision of God that Ezekiel gets? And my first point, it may seem very, very obvious, but the first point is that God actually exists. God is real. Now, this may not be something that many people struggle with, especially in church on a Sunday morning, but it's a big issue for people outside, isn't it? It's hard to get the exact figures, but in the UK, some surveys between 20 to 40% describe themselves as agnostic or atheistic. The Irish census in 2022, about 14% describe themselves as being of no religion. Again, surveys overlap, but the belief in God's non-existence amongst people that we work with, some of our family members, and people that we interact with outside, we play sports with, do not believe that God exists. Whereas Ezekiel, well, we've said that he's in exile. Jerusalem hasn't fallen yet. That doesn't happen until chapter 33, but its end is near, along with the temple. And maybe when Ezekiel and the people that are in exile, that's the question they're asking themselves. Well, does God exist? Is he real? If he is real, well, how could he allow this to happen? How could he allow the temple to be destroyed? How could he allow his nation to be scattered? That's a question many people struggle with now. Well, if God exists, how can he allow this thing to happen? How can he allow famine? How can he allow war? How can he allow disease? And here's God. He doesn't show himself to a priest in Jerusalem, which is 900 miles away, but he reveals himself to one person miles away from his homeland, Babylon, by the rivers of Babylon. If you know me, you know that I quite like cats. One of the things that fascinates me about cats is that they're kind of territorial. So one cat fights off another cat to keep it out of its territory. And in a way, the understanding of the gods in the Old Testament was a little bit like that. Gods didn't kind of muscle into other gods' territory. And therefore, you wouldn't expect the God of Jerusalem to show up in Babylon. What was he doing there? And yet, one of the impacts of this vision that's so far away from Jerusalem, so far away from the temple, is God is saying, well, here I am. You might be in exile, you might be scattered, but I am here. I am still here. So how do we interact? Perhaps maybe for many of us here, we're not asking the question, does God exist? But how do we relate to those who deny God's existence? To those we work with, those we talk with, who say, well, I don't believe God exists at all. Maybe it's hard to have a spiritual conversation when the other person appears to kind of shut down the discussion by saying they don't even believe in God. It's worth maybe saying that maybe things are changing a little bit. We've had we've been reminded in prayer meetings about how in the land of France, and if you think of France, it's hard to think of a country in the world which has done more to separate church and state and to a more secular country than France, but yet in the last year or two we've seen, and this has been a phenomenon that's been picked up not just by Christian circles but in mainstream news, that there's been an increase in particularly young people in France going to church. This is happening both in evangelical churches and in the Catholic Church. And this was another picture of Boney M. How it ended up there. But this has been one of the best-selling books in France for the last year. It sold over 400,000 copies. It's just been published in English. That's the English topic there, but it's arguing from a scientific perspective as to the existence of God. It's from two, I think they're arguing from the point of view of quantum mechanics and quantum physics. They're both scientists and engineers, from a Catholic background, but things have changed a little bit. But how do we, and that's maybe something that we could perhaps use in discussions with people as to whether we believe God exists or not, but I think it's worthwhile recognizing that we need to recognize that believing in God's existence is actually an act of faith. It's also worth pointing out that believing in God itself isn't enough to make you a Christian, isn't enough to make you a believer. It might be a good start, but as James says, that the demons and the devils also believe that God is one, that he exists, and they tremble. Conversely, believing in God's non-existence is also an act of faith. What does the Bible tell us? Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6, that great chapter we have on faith. But verse 6 says, without faith it's impossible to please him, for whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists, that he lives, that he is. And not just that he exists, but that he rewards those who seek after him. Maybe that'll be an encouragement to somebody here. You're seeking, you're not sure. So to seek after God is pleasing to him. And he promises to reveal himself to those who seek. The opposite is true though, and tragically, God will hide himself from people who are determined to reject him. And this verse in Hebrews 11:6 leads us neatly into the second point. Well, not only does God exist, but God reveals himself. Revelation. You might have grown up with and again, just saying that God's revealing himself. I grew up with a hymn in school, and maybe you've heard it at sort of royal weddings and things like that. The hymn, an old hymn, we maybe give out about some of the newer hymns, but I think this is a particularly bad one. Immortal, invisible, God only wise, in light inaccessible, hid from our eyes. Very kind of lofty sentiments, aren't they? It's a hymn that actually never mentions Christ. It's a hymn that perhaps a Sikh or a Buddhist could sing quite happily. God inaccessible, hid from our eyes. That's not true. This is a load of nonsense. God does not want to hide from us. He is not inaccessible. The story of the Bible is how God reveals himself. It starts right in Genesis, doesn't it? Adam and Eve sin, and yet we see that God comes to walk with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden at the cool of the day. It must have been a regular thing that happened. And they hide from his presence. And as we read on through the Bible, we see this, how God in the most strange way, well, he wants to reveal himself to people, and he picks an individual, a man called Abraham. And he walks with him, and he talks with him, and he directs him, and he meets with him. And God makes Abraham into a family, into a people, and into a nation. And at the end of the book of Ezekiel, there's a vision that Ezekiel gets of a new temple and a new Jerusalem. And this vision finishes off this vision of this new city and the new temple. And Ezekiel writes down, he says, the name of that city is, the Lord is there. God reveals himself. He wants to be with people, with us. And he speaks to his people through law, through his messengers, the prophets, by direct intervention in their human history, by directly revealing himself through visions. But the Bible tells us that all these revelations of God in the Old Testament are leading up to the ultimate revelation of himself through Jesus Christ. We've got 4 weeks to Christmas, coming up to carol services, and maybe we'll attend carol services, and you might hear this verse read from John chapter 1. It says, no one has ever seen God, but God, the one and only, who is at the Father's side. He has made him known. If we want to see what God is like, if we want the perfect revelation of God the Father, it's through Jesus Christ. We see in Ezekiel's vision here, and Ezekiel he's so overwhelmed by this vision that he's kind of knocked out for about 7 days afterwards. But he writes down that it's the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. When Moses sees God, well, he doesn't see God in all his glory, he just sees his back. God has to hide his face from him. But through Jesus, we get the perfect revelation of what God is like. And if we want to know what God is like, we need to get to know Jesus Christ. What does Jesus say to his disciples? Well, to a disciple called Philip in John 14, and Philip asks, he says, Lord, show us the Father, and that'll be enough for us. Jesus answers, don't you know me, Philip, after I've been with you for such a long time? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. Maybe there's somebody here and you don't yet know Jesus Christ. Well, this is what it's all about. This is why we meet together, why we read the scriptures. This is Christianity. It's about knowing Jesus. It's about a relationship with a living person, with Jesus Christ, who is God himself. And perhaps one of the greatest questions we can ask ourselves, how do we get to know God? Well, we get to know God by a relationship with Jesus Christ. This is how we see God, through Jesus. Our third point, first of all, God exists. Secondly, he reveals himself. Thirdly, well, what happens when we see God? What's the effect? Or why does God even show himself to us? Well, it's not just for the fun of it, is it? God, and we broke into with Eunice's section there in chapter 2. After this incredible revelation that Ezekiel gets of God, he sees God, but what's it for? Well, God speaks to him, and he says, and there's a voice from the throne. I heard the voice of one speaking, and he says, Son of man, stand on your feet, and I will speak with you. We've seen the effect that it has on Ezekiel, and we see this pattern throughout Scripture, don't we? When people see something of the glory of God, they're overwhelmed, they're knocked out. Ezekiel, it says that he lies amongst the exiles for 7 days, overwhelmed. He can barely speak, and in fact he's probably struck dumb from this vision itself. But every time there's one of these encounters with the glory of God's presence, it's with a purpose. And Ezekiel is given a message. If you were to read on in chapter 2, he's given a message to his own people. It's a message of judgment, and it's a message of hope. And for all of us here, I hope that we are seeking after God's presence, that we are seeking to know Jesus better, to become more Christ-like ourselves. What does the Bible tell us? In 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 20, we are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us. We implore you, on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. So a challenge for all of us, and we sang together, open the eyes of my heart. We hope that as we meet together, we will see more of God, as we encourage each other, and throughout the week, as we pray, as we spend time in God's presence, as we study the Scriptures. Well, I need to ask myself, well, do I just read it, and off I go, and my life is unchanged afterwards? Ezekiel's life is totally transformed. He is given a message, and he's given a purpose, a message from God. And this is the pattern. But do we go away unchanged? Is our behavior changed, or is our thinking and is our mindset so changed that we go into a world that rejects God, and we want to share this message, this good news? We are therefore Christ's ambassadors, imploring others to be reconciled to God. We can get to know him. So God is there. He reveals himself through Scripture, and ultimately through Jesus Christ. And as we see more of him, as we get to know Jesus, he will use us as his messengers to a world that rejects him, to our families, to our friends, to our work colleagues, maybe to the ends of the earth.